Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 10 on the Name of the Rose, and tonight we are going to be exploring the library in various forms. We're going to be first discussing the infiltration of the library by Brother William and Adso, and then I'm gonna hope to get up to Adso's very intriguing contemplations on the library in the beginning of day 3. So let's see. Let's see how we do. But first of all, I want one quick announcement tonight. This weekend, on Saturday, November 23rd, is going to be the launch event for our fall fundraising campaign this year. Signum University is celebrating its annual fundraising campaign, where we thank all of the wonderful, generous people, like so many of you, who have donated to help support Signum over the years. I'm going to be talking about the campaign and the really exciting things we're going to be talking about during the campaign. We have a whole bunch of new stuff that is being developed or released or increased or improved. Lots of really fun things that are happening around Signum that are going to be on display over the course of the fundraising campaign. So, Saturday, November 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Tune in on precisely the channels on which you are tuning right now. That is to everyone who is watching live. In any case, we'll be on Twitch. We'll be on our YouTube channel. And our Facebook page. Twitter's not taking me anymore. That is, Twitter wants me to pay and I don't want to. Anyway, so it's anyway, so that's what's happening. Saturday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time is our event this weekend. So I hope that you will be able to join us. All right, let's get back to the text here. So they have a conversation with Alenardo. Alenardo, remember, is the really old guy. He's the oldest monk in the monastery. And he has several interesting perspectives. He talks about how it's almost the millennium. Now, okay. Sorry, I'm making my... How do I explain this without taking a really long time? There is a... In the book of Revelation... the narrator of the book of Revelation speaks of a 1,000-year rule. It's it's a really small reference. It's just a verse or two that refers to the fact that Jesus will return and the saints, the holy ones, will rule with him for 1,000 years. It's like one or two verses. It's seriously a very, very small reference in Revelation. And it's hard for me to think of another passage or another verse in the New Testament that has had a more outsized influence than that one. How you understand and interpret that has been literally a defining element for like whole branches of Christianity. It's a little bit weird. It's a little bit weird. Even I mean, I'm a Christian, and even I find it a little bit weird. But yes, it's almost always the millennium. So anyhow, this is the conversation that I wanted to talk about begins when Alenardo makes a reference to the fact that the 1,000-year rule is almost over. The most popular way to understand... So again, the verse in Revelation says, Jesus comes back, he establishes the 1,000-year rule, his 1,000-year rule in the earth with his saints, with his followers, and then the end of the world comes after the 1,000 years, right? So there's the 1,000-year rule. Now, even just that summary would like deeply offend many, many, many people, because like people have different interpretations as to when it comes and when it falls and everything. Whatever. the point is, yeah, there we go. JJ, thank you for giving. That is the whole reference to it and context. So it's like 5 entire verses that JJ just quoted there at the beginning of Revelation chapter 20. In the Middle Ages, the most common way to interpret the promise of the millennium, they interpreted it, they were in it, like they believed themselves to be in it. Basically that the 1,000-year rule began after Christ's ascension. And then there was going to be the 1,000-year rule. Like the church basically, like the world that they lived in Europe was a world that was, essentially ruled by the church. So they were like, Jesus's holy ones are in fact ruling, right? And so this is why, by the way, in the year 1000, there was an enormous emphasis on, like, everybody thought the end of the world was coming. Like in the year 1000, everyone's like, that's it. It's over. End of the world is here. We know this, because they were like, the 1,000-year rule has come to an end, right? And now the end of the world is coming. So this is what Alenardo and Brother Williams have just been talking about. Brother Williams is like, yeah, but the millennium past, like, he's like, that interpretation has been disproven by events. Why, Alenardo, are you saying that the millennium is almost over? Like, Alenardo's saying the end of the world is coming right now. Because the 1,000-year reign of Jesus has ended, and Brother William is confused because he says, well, but the 1,000-year, that passed hundreds of years ago. It's the 1300s, remember, when they're talking here. So he's like, what's going on? So Alenardo says, the millennium is not calculated from the death of Christ, but from the donation of Constantine 3 centuries later. Now it is 1,000 years. So the reign of the just is ending, says Brother William. I do not know. I do not know any more. I am tired. The calculation is difficult. Beatus of Liabana made it. Ask Jorge. He is young. He remembers well. But the time is ripe. Did you not hear the 7 trumpets? Why the 7 trumpets? Footnote. It's, again, in Revelation, there are 7 trumpets sound, and with the sounding of each trumpet, something happens. You may have heard of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's a kind of a misleading phrase. And they're not depicted in Revelation, much like they're depicted in, say, Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. But in any case, those are the seals. The 7 seals are broken, and the 7 trumpets sound, and the 7 bowls of wrath are poured out on the world. There's like 7 different sets of 7 different plagues. So yeah, sorry. I was thinking the breaking of the 7 seals is the first 4 seals are when the horsemen come out. Okay, so but the 7 trumpets, when the 7 trumpets sound, 7 different disasters happen on the face of the earth. And the point of the disasters is that they are signs that the end is coming. That's how Alenardo is interpreting this. So he says, did you not hear the 7 trumpets? And those are the 7 trumpets he's referring to. The 7 trumpets of the apocalypse. Yes, the 7 trumpets are, that's, so when the 7th seal is broken, so it's a scroll. It's a scroll. So like, you know how a scroll can be internally sealed, right? You unroll a scroll, and then you put a dollop of hot wax and you roll it up so that as the wax cools, it seals the book at that place. So when you're unrolling the book, like, you break the seal that holds it closed on the outside, and then you can unroll it a little ways, and then there's another seal. So you got to break the 2nd seal and open it more, and then break the 3rd seal and open it more. So it's about the progressive revelation of the book, right? Is what the breaking of the 7 seals is about. And yes, so when the 7th seal is broken in Revelation chapter 8, then the 7 trumpets come out. And the 7 trumpets are, again, these sort of 7 disasters. Why the 7 trumpets, says Brother Williams. Did you not hear how the other boy died, the illuminator? The first angel sounded the first trumpet, and hail and fire fell mingled with blood. The second angel sounded the second trumpet, and the third part of the sea became blood. Did the second boy not die in the sea of blood? Watch out for the third trumpet. The third part of the creatures of the sea will die. That's what happens with the third trumpet blows. God punishes us. The world all around the abbey is rank with heresy. They tell me that on the throne of Rome there is a perverse pope who uses hosts for practices of necromancy and feeds them to his mores. Mores? Like seriously, like he's eels? And feeds the host to them? Wow, that would be horrible. And in our midst, someone has violated the ban, has broken the seals of the labyrinth. Who told you that? I heard it. All were whispering that sin has entered the abbey. Do you have any chickpeas? Okay. So, do you see what's happening here? Do you see the framework that Alenardo has? We have seen again and again repetitions and emphasis on the coming of the Antichrist and the end of the world, on the fulfillment of the prophecies of the book of Revelation. And yes, Arthur, the chickpeas are a complete non sequitur, I believe. There are in fact no chickpeas alluded to explicitly in the book of Revelation, though, perhaps one could say the chickpeas are implied symbolically. But Alenardo is demonstrating a certain school of interpretation, right? Alenardo is not surprised at all by the murders that are happening in the abbey, right? It's exactly what he expects to happen. Because it's the end of the millennium. The end of the world has come. Did you not hear the 7 trumpets? Like, he's heard the trumpets. Alenardo has heard the trumpets and expects to see the disasters happen. And what happens? What happens is he sees the people die. But you notice it's really interesting. On the one hand, so he's paralleling these. The first person who died plummeted to his death, which correlates with the hail and fire that fell mingled with blood from the sky. The second person died immersed in a vat of blood. And the second plague, announced by the second trumpet, has a third part of the sea becoming blood. That's the second plague. The plagues, by the way, the 7 plagues are reminiscent of and connected to the 10 plagues in Exodus. And then watch out for the third trumpet. The third part of the creatures in the sea will die. What does that mean? Alenardo clearly expects the next person to die to be drowned, right? Because the third trumpet has the third part of the sea becoming blood. Do you see what's kind of interesting about this? What's kind of interesting about this is that there are kind of 2 different things going on. On the one hand, Alenardo is he believes the revelation is happening, right? And he takes that unquestioningly as this sort of model. He's not surprised by these shocking murders that are happening because they fit precisely into his schema, his interpretive schema. Remember that upwards interpretation. He already knows the answer. And when you already know the answer, you see lots of evidence that points in that direction, or you can make the evidence point in that direction. This is one of the things that William expressed concern about when he, even in that first conversation with the abbot, was expressing concern and explaining why he ceased to be an inquisitor. But do you see what else it reveals? It reveals Alenardo's own frame of reference. Alenardo's very old. He's like 80 or 90 or something. I mean, he's very old. I don't remember exactly how old he was. I don't remember if it said exactly how old he was, but he's the oldest person by far in the monastery. And he's been in the monastery his whole life. So you see, the 7 trumpets of the angels. We'll come back to the universities and the monasteries, Gerald. But the 7 trumpets of the angels describe global disasters. A third part of the sea become like the oceans, becoming blood. That's what happens when the second trumpet sounds. Alenardo feels that that prophecy has been fulfilled by the murder of Venantius. Gerald, exactly. The monastery is a sign for the world. The monastery is the little world. But for Alenardo, it's the only world he's ever known. Alenardo will not have left the walls of this monastery for probably 70 years, 80 years. It's probably been 70 or 80 years since he has been outside. That's at least very possible. It's conceivable that he might have, in his younger days, been one of those monks that was sent out on to bear messages or something. It happens sometimes. Sometimes a monk is given a job outside. But anyway, he this is his whole world. This is the world to him. And so, yes, you can see, and others have said, that the monastery is like a little picture of the whole world. But to Alenardo, it is the entire world. And what he's watching is the catastrophe of that world. The threat of the apocalypse of that world. And maybe he's not wrong, right? Maybe he's actually correct about that. But to him, it's enough. This is a fulfillment of that prophecy. This is another thing about the interpretations, the framework that they have. Anyway, let's keep going. More on Alenardo later. This is when Brother William and Adso sneak into the a scriptorium after dark when everybody's asleep. He had picked up the sheet of parchment, holding it to his face, and instead of stepping behind him and holding the lamp high over his head, I foolishly stood directly in front of him. He asked me to move aside, and as I did, I grazed the back of the page with the flame. William pushed me away, asking me whether I wanted to burn the manuscript for him. Then he cried out. I saw clearly some vague signs, in a yellow-brown color, had appeared on the upper part of the page. William made me give him the lamp and moved it behind the page, holding the flame fairly close to the surface of the parchment, which he heated without setting it afire. Slowly, as if an invisible hand were writing Mane Tekel Perez, I saw some marks emerge one by one on the white side of the sheet as William moved the lamp, and as the smoke that rose from the top of the flame blackened the recto, the marks did not resemble those of any alphabet, except that of necromancers. Yeah, not creepy at all, says Jackie. I agree. Remember what I said last time about Umberto Eco in this book contemplating signs and the interpretation of signs, different kinds of signs and the interpretation of those signs in like as thorough and academic a manner as Tolkien did different linguistic change situations in the Silmarillion. Here we have another one, right? You have a manuscript, which Adso can't read to begin with, because it's written in Greek. And then they discover another message written over top of the other writing on the parchment in invisible ink, which is made visible by the heat of the candle. But the letters revealed in the invisible ink, revealed by the heat of the candle, are in cipher, right? So you have, and his description of it appearing. I want to make sure everyone is following the allusion he makes there. Slowly, as if an invisible hand were writing Mane Tekel Perez, I saw some marks emerge one by one. Yes, the references to Daniel. The references to Daniel chapter 5, the impious feast of Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, and Belshazzar has the holy vessels, the holy golden vessels that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem, brought out to use at a party. And when this happens, it didn't. It was not apparently not appreciated. A hand appears before them and writes on the wall, Mane Tekel Ufarsin Perez. It's different versions of it, but anyway, it's these three words. The first one usually repeated twice. This, by the way, is where the expression "the writing on the wall" comes from. Like, he's seen the writing on the wall, for instance. It's fascinating. I always used to point this out to my undergrads. There are a small number of biblical references that I think are kept alive in the consciousness of most Americans purely by sports commentators. This is one of them. Whenever a coach is about to be fired, some sports journalist is guaranteed to say that he has seen the writing on the wall. Always. The other one, by the way, is David and Goliath, when some extreme underdog team beats a very prominent and talented team. Those are the two biblical references that, like, most people in America are still familiar with, but I think that most of the people in America are familiar with them from, like, football broadcasts. But anyway, so the writing on the wall, they don't understand it. It's not in their language. They can't interpret it. So Belshazzar promises these great rewards to anybody who can interpret the writing, and the prophet Daniel is called upon and he interprets it. And so it's like, you'll be made second in command of the entire kingdom if you can interpret this. And so Daniel comes and he's like, I can read it. It says that you have been, weighed in the balance and found wanting, and that the Medes and Persians are coming to destroy you and take over your kingdom and kill you. You're about to lose your kingdom entirely. And Belshazzar's like, okay, thanks. You're second in command, briefly. And he is second in command for like 12 hours, until the Medes and Persians come and conquer him the next day. Anyway, that's the story of the invisible hand writing mysterious signs on the wall, but not just mysterious signs that are impossible for almost everybody to understand, but also signs of doom, portents of doom. Adzo finds it very creepy, as if these letters magically appear, and it looks like it would need another Daniel, right, to be able to know what they were. He feels as if this could be, a message from God himself. Oh, JJ, you were right. The third ruler in the kingdom. Now, he already had a number 2. Daniel got promoted to number 3. Completely right. Thank you, JJ, for pointing that out. Yeah. Uh, third in command. Yep, there it is. There it is. Um, okay. Anyway, the layers of signs and the interpretation of signs. This moment, I assume William was already making progress towards deciphering breaking the code, and figuring out what it says. The symbols being used in this writing in invisible ink are the zodiacal symbols. By the way, I find people are often confused about that, or surprised to find zodiacal symbols in frequent use in the Middle Ages. The answer to that, by the way, we associate the zodiac, the signs of the zodiac, almost exclusively with astrology. Like, it does literally in our society does not come up except for like making astrological predictions, right? Of one kind or another. But that's not how they were mostly used. Astrology was certainly a known thing in the Middle Ages. But it wasn't even primarily about, like, modern astrology is like totally Bush League. Like, it's very lightweight. Like the kind of astrology that we've probably all seen, the kind that you get in like tabloid newspapers and stuff like that, is incredibly clumsy, right? I mean, like, if you are this sign, like if you were born under this sign, then this is what's going to happen to you today or whatever. Like it's bizarre because it's like, what? So seriously, like 1/12 of the population of the world, this is gonna happen to 1/12 of everybody. You know what I mean? Like it's enormous from the perspective of medieval astrology. It's incredibly amateurish. The people who did astrology in the Middle Ages did a great deal more than that. And they were much more interested in the planets, like where the planets are aligned, because that's where the real juice is from. Obviously, it's not really the constellations at all. The constellations are just a way of measuring. The 12 zodiacal signs, the year is divided into the 12 zodiacal signs. And so that's like, the zodiacal signs are something like, almost like a unit of measure to talk about astronomy, to talk about astrology. They were mostly used for calendars. When you talk, so like think, for instance, I sincerely hope that some of you were compelled to memorize the first 14 lines of the Canterbury Tales at some point in your lives. If not, it's not too late. But you may remember, if you have, that Chaucer in the opening lines to the Canterbury Tales says, refers to how the youngest son hath in the ram his halve course run. How the young son, it's young because it's still early in the year, has run his course halfway through the ram, through the sign of the ram, through Aries, right? He tells you the sun is in the ram. He's not doing astrology. He's not making predictions. He's not alluding to predictions. He's telling you the date, right? Like it's this, the sun is halfway through the ram. It's the beginning of April, folks, right? That's what that means. That's what his audience knew that he meant by that. And that's what most references to the astrological signs are doing. And that's why, so like when you see somebody who has, like if in a work of art, they've chosen to array all 12 signs of the zodiac in order, say, it's not a, some kind of, necromantic, as Adso thinks. It's not some kind of sorceress thing. It's not divination necessarily. I mean, it could potentially be, theoretically, but it certainly isn't necessarily. The 12 signs of the zodiac in order mean the year, right? It's a way to map the passing of time. I mean, it isn't any more arcane necessarily, any more occult than like a a wall calendar for, modern people. So, anyway, that's, yeah. Anyhow, that's why it's not at all strange. Like, what he's using here is a series of familiar symbols, which are an alternative. I mean, this is almost like using numbers, which, like Arabic numbers, still not really caught on yet in Europe. So the zodiacal signs present themselves as potentially a kind of alternative alphabet, because they're like signs that you can draw in shorthand, and they have a particular sequence, right? So you can map letters onto them and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's what they turn out to be. But you can see the kind of mystique that they have, even when you find that out, right? They are still associated with the heavens and the divine order, how God has set the universe in motion the way that it is. And they were, in the Middle Ages, I mean, medievals were in awe, appropriately, I think, of astronomy. They were extremely careful observational astronomers, the medievals were. They knew a lot about the stars. They knew the precise angle that the equator and the ecliptic made. Like, they knew exactly how far the Earth was tilted over and that it was tilted. I mean, like, they knew all these things. And obviously they know that the world was round. They knew what the equator was and what it meant. They knew what the ecliptic was and what it meant, the tilt of the Earth. So yeah, like this, they knew all that stuff, and they figured all that stuff out without telescopes, just by naked eye observations, which is pretty cool and pretty hard to do if you've never done that before. Modern people don't realize how spoiled they are with stuff like that. Anyway, this moment where these signs, which he does not recognize, he knows they're not any alphabet. That is, they're not Latin letters. They're not Greek letters. He doesn't know what they are, right? But they look like strange symbols. And so Adso speculates there might be perhaps the alphabet of necromancers. But it turns out to be an alphabet that is built on signs of the heavens, which is then connected back to the idea, Adso's sort of naive impression of the invisible ink filling in, right? Now, obviously, Brother William and Adso are having very different experiences here. And yet, for both of them, they are watching hidden signs appear. A sign, letters that are designed to convey a message, but signs that are concealed, doubly concealed in a cipher alphabet, concealed to be made literally invisible on the page, so that you've got these things that point to things, but do so invisibly, like they can only be disclosed by certain people. It's a pretty fun illustration, but again, try to think through what this implies, what this means about what you're conveying and how. Where else have we seen deliberately confusing code before in this book? Where else have we seen signs which were deliberately designed to convey meaning to a very few, but actively to conceal their meaning from everybody else? Where have we seen that? Yes, Devora, the call numbers on the books, the catalog that the librarian has, right? The library itself is like this. this parchment that William is holding, which he hopes and believes is a message about some secret in the library, is itself like almost a symbol of the library itself, a reflection of the secrecy of the library itself. All right. Anyway, more on the cipher. Brother William has talked about cracking the code, right? How you can figure out what this unknown alphabet means. Adso is like at his most naive. He's totally out Dr. Watsoning Dr. Watson in this passage. Is it possible? I asked, awed. Yes, if you know a bit of the learning of the Arabs. The best treatises on cryptography are the work of infidel scholars, and at Oxford I was able to have some read to me. Bacon was right in saying that the conquest of learning is achieved through the knowledge of languages. Abu Bakr Ahmad bin Ali bin Washia an-Nabati wrote centuries ago a book of the frenzied desire of the devout to learn the riddles of ancient writings, which is, by the way, a fantastic title. A book of the frenzied desire of the devout to learn the riddles of ancient writings, and he expounded many rules for composing and deciphering mysterious alphabets. Useful for magic practices, but also for the correspondence between armies, or between a king and his envoys. I have seen other Arab books that list a series of quite ingenious devices. For example, you can substitute one letter for another. You can write a word backward. You can put the letters in reverse order, using only every other one, and then starting over again you can, as in this case, replace letters with zodiacal signs, but attributing to the hidden letters their numerical value, and then, according to another alphabet, convert the numbers into other letters. William loves this. Notice what William emphasizes. What William emphasizes here, he focuses on the fact that although these signs, which are paradoxical in the sense that they're pointing to things in a way that prevents anybody from seeing what things they're pointing to, right? Like the message that intends to be not understood. That's the sort of the paradox of code, of cipher, right? But what William emphasizes is that this is meant to be read. And it can be read. It can even be figured out by somebody who was not told the code in advance. Even if someone is attempting to hide the message from you, you can figure it out. He focuses on this as not on the apparent nonsense that it seems to be, which is like nonsense is like a sign that points nowhere, right? Instead, he emphasizes the fact that it clearly does point to something, and therefore there's a method, right? It's going to be possible to figure it out. But I'd go back for a second to that title. The Book of the Frenzied Desire of the Devout to Learn the Riddles of Ancient Writings. Doesn't that seem like that could be the subtitle of the book that we're reading? Hasn't this whole book so far been a book of the frenzied desire of the devout to learn the riddles of ancient writings? Yeah, as Mighty Felix says, seems a bit on the nose, even. Yeah, exactly. More on the frenzied desire of the devout later on. Now they're in the library itself. Remember, they have the scuffle. There's somebody else there, and he steals William's spectacles, and Adso bravely chases him around but loses him. The room, as I said, had 7 walls. Now they're in the library. But only 4 of them had an opening, a passage flanked by 2 little columns set in the wall. The opening was fairly wide, surmounted by a round-headed arch. Against the blind walls stood huge cases laden with books neatly arranged. Each case bore a scroll with a number, and so did each individual shelf. Obviously, the same numbers we had seen in the catalogue. In the midst of the room was a table, also covered with books. On all of the volumes lay a fairly light coat of dust, sign that the books were cleaned with some frequency. nor was there dirt of any kind on the floor. Above one of the archways, a big scroll painted on the wall bore the words Apocalypsis Jesu Christi. It did not seem faded, even though the lettering was ancient. We noticed afterward, also in the other rooms, that these scrolls were actually carved in the stone, cut fairly deeply, and the depressions had subsequently been filled with color. That's, of course, why the words did not seem fit. At first, he thinks they're just painted on a flat wall, and paint on a flat wall fades quickly because the light, shines full on it. Whereas if the letters are carven and the paint is on the inside, then the light doesn't shine square on it as much. Okay. This is the first room that they come into, I think. And of course, so we see, first of all, they're beginning to see, and so anyway, is beginning to see the secret of the code, right? The secret code of the catalog. There's a number of the room, and there's the number of the bookshelves, right? The number of the bookcases, and then the number of the individual shelves. And so this is the thing. These are the things that those signs were pointing to. He's seeing the actual things themselves. And of course, the things that are being pointed to are also themselves understood to be signs, because what is up above, high on the wall? Apocalypsis Jesu Christi, which just means the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's the beginning of the book of Revelation. Apocalypse, of course, is just the Greek for revelation. Anyway, the book of Revelation, the focus on the book of Revelation is not just the interpretation of the monks locally. When the library was made, carved in the walls of these rooms, in this first room is the Apocalypse of Jesu Christi, and you'll remember in every other room a different quotation from the Revelation, from the Apocalypse, is carved up on the walls, as if the rooms themselves form a text, and that text is the Apocalypse, the revelation of the end of the world. The whole thing is a sign. The whole library is a sign. Another thing that's important to remember, we've been talking about Revelation. We've been talking about the Apocalypse, but we've not really been paying attention. At least I've not been really paying attention to what I'm saying. What is the opposite of apocalypse? The opposite. What does it mean to calypso something? Apocalypso. Apo means to undo it, right? It's the un prefix in Greek, apo. What is, to cover up. To cover up. To veil or cover up. Homer plays on this a lot. Calypso, right? The nymph Calypso. Odysseus is covered up, right? On the Isle of Calypso. But then what happens to Odysseus at the end, right? He gets back to Ithaca, and what does he do? He calypsos himself, right? He covers himself up. And then there's the great apocalypse, the revelation, when he reveals himself to be who he was. And we absolutely could go all the way back to Till We Have Faces, Jackie. Absolutely. Lots of apocalypse happening there. But what is the primary theme about the library here? Concealment, secrecy. And here in the library is Apocalypsis Jesu Christi. It's about revelation, but it's also about concealment, right? Anyway, it's the play on apocalypse and concealment, on the unveiling and the concealing, right? It's very much something that we're supposed to be thinking about, especially when we think about the library, right? Yeah, let's keep going. So you remember there are a bunch of obstacles that they face. There's a strange mirror, like a distorted mirror, which Adso takes for a, for a devil, a demon, that's waiting them. They're like finding, Brother William is delighted to find the answers to the mysteries, right? Like he knew that he did not believe that there were ghosts of dead librarians cruising around in the library. He did not believe that there were demons waiting there to attack people. He figured that there was some explanation. Here's the second incident when Adso has his vision. And so I did. I proceeded through 3 rooms, sticking close to the walls, light as a cat, or as a novice descending into the kitchen to steal cheese from the larder, an enterprise in which I excelled at milk. I came to the threshold of the room from which the glow, quite faint, was coming. I slipped along the wall to a column that served as the right jamb, and I peered into the room. Remember there was that other monk who was creeping around, and so they're thinking like this might be him? No one was there. A kind of lamp was set on the table, lighted, and it was smoking, flickering. It was not a lamp like ours. It seemed rather an uncovered thurible. Remember what a thurible is? A thurible is the ball at the end of the chain that you put burning incense in. And if you've ever been to a Catholic or like a high Episcopalian service or something, and you swing it around to sense or to. It's one I love this this wordplay. You don't get to use it much, but you literally incense the room, right? It's always, I always get very childish. Like when I see somebody doing that, I'm like, I am incensed. But anyhow, yeah. So the thurible is the ball. It's the thing that you put the incense in, basically. Okay. It seemed rather an uncovered thurible. It had no flame, but a light ash smoldered, burning something. I plucked up my courage and entered. On the table, beside the thurible, a brightly colored book was lying open. I approached and saw 4 strips of different colors on the page: yellow, cinnabar, turquoise, and burnt sienna. A beast was set there, horrible to see, a great dragon with 10 heads, dragging after him the stars of the sky, and with his tail making them fall to earth. From the Revelation, of course. And suddenly I saw the dragon multiply, and the scales of his hide became a kind of forest of glittering shards that came off the page and took to circling around my head. I flung my head back, and I saw the ceiling of the room bend and press down toward me, and then I heard something like the hiss of 1,000 serpents, but not frightening, almost seductive, and a woman appeared, bathed in light, and put her face to mine, breathing on me. I thrust her away with outstretched hands, and my hands seemed to touch the books in the case opposite, or to grow out of all proportion. I no longer realized where I was, where the earth was, where the sky. In the center of the room I saw Berengar staring at me with a hateful smile, oozing lust. I covered my face with my hands, and my hands seemed the claws of a toad, slimy and webbed. I cried out, I believe. There was an acid taste in my mouth. I plunged into infinite darkness, which seemed to yawn wider and wider beneath me, and then I knew nothing further. Okay. No, Barriadir, this is not the kind of incense traditionally used during worship services of the Catholic or Episcopalian Church. Yeah. Oh man, Karina, I remember the day I discovered that the word apocalypse was just the Greek word for revelation. Like, that's a legitimate phenomenon when you make that connection. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Adso's vision. On the one hand, you can see elements in this which are a clear description of his own altered senses, right? There are strange herbs being burned in this thurible. And Adso is getting knocked out. He is here tripping on whatever is being burned in this room. Notice how it begins with a picture on the book, an illumination, like Adso's illumination. And like Adso's illuminations, it's a fantastical illumination, not just a dragon, but a 10-headed dragon, dragging the stars, dragging after him the stars of the sky, and with his tail making them fall to earth. That is certainly a fantastical vision and a fantastical beast. But it's a fantastical beast that's in the Bible, right? It's in the book of Revelation, that thing. Fantastical in the sense no one's ever seen anything exactly like that, right? But that thing comes to life. And begins, and things start circling around his head, right? The room presses in around him. We get that hiss of 1,000 serpents, almost seductive. And the woman who appears bathed in light and put her face to his, breathing on her. He's seeing all these things. These look like signs. He's having a vision. How is this to be interpreted? What does this mean? Do we interpret the sound of the serpents? What does that mean? Do we interpret the woman who appeared in front of him? What does that signify? How are we to understand this? What does this tell? Is this a revelation of the future? But notice there are a whole bunch of things that happen here. First of all, if we were told, that is, if through its context or through other comments, the narrator of this story, like if Adso himself told us that this vision he received, if he was like, this was a vision of the future, as you, dear reader, will see, that every detail of this was borne out, though in a shocking and unexpected way. If he'd said something like that in the narrative, we'd have bought it, right? And what's more, encouraged by such a sentence, we could look at this and we could make explanations, right? We've been given plenty to be able to see what might the dragon here represent. What might the hissing serpents, the seductive hissing serpents represent? How about the woman who appears face to face in front of him? But the problem is, we could come up with many interpretations of that, right? The woman could be the embodiment of temptation, right? This could be he's a monk. This could be a sexual temptation, right? So you could have a very negative association with that if you're Adso. But it might not be. Maybe she's Lady Wisdom. Wisdom is characterized as a lady. As a woman in the book of Proverbs. So maybe it's Lady Wisdom. Maybe this is, maybe it's the Virgin Mary. Maybe this is a warning, right? Putting her face to mine, breathing on me, like God breathed in the face of Adam, like Jesus breathed in the face of the disciples. Oh yeah, no, this is probably a good thing, unless it's a bad thing, right? I mean, I could easily produce a reading of these symbols which would suggest that Adso was being given a divine gift of insight and, was like going to be a blessing to the world, or that this was a sign of like hideous evil and temptation closing in around him. I mean, like there's, you could do it. You could do it either way. There doesn't seem to be an obviously right or wrong answer unless you know the answer. already. And I think that's part of the point here of this vision. Now, at the same time, what else are we told about it? We're also told, what's Brother William's interpretation of this event? Brother William's interpretation of this event is, oh yeah, you inhaled some burning herbs which caused your visions. They don't mean anything. They don't mean anything because it's just a side effect of the drug that was administered through that smoke, right? So it's not, in fact, they're not significant portents of the future. It's partly your own fears, partly your own desires, partly, your memories of things that you've just been hearing about. That's all. So, Mighty Felix, in that case, they would be just a thing. I mean, still a thing had happened. He saw the things, right? Brother William would seem to argue that these things that he saw, they're just things. They don't point to anything. They're not signs, in fact. In that way, they're not signs. They're just things. Or are they? Whether or not you even determine if something is a sign depends on your frame of reference. Depends on your context in a lot of ways. And also whether you think you already know the answer or not. Jocelyn says, but we who have lived through the 60s and 70s in the U.S. recognize a trip when we see one. Yes, apparently Brother William is right there with you. Okay. Jumping ahead to the beginning of book 3. Bet you didn't think we'd get to book 3 today, but we totally are. Remember that, towards Lodz, Berengar has vanished. They haven't found Berengar, which of course totally convinces William that he was the one whom Edso was chasing, right? The one who was there in the scriptorium with them. Towards Lodz, searching Berengar's cell, a monk found under the pallet a white cloth stained with blood. He showed it to the abbot, who drew the direst omens from it. Jorge was present, and as soon as he was informed, he said, "Blood?" as if the thing seemed improbable to him. They told Alenardo, who shook his head and said, No, at the third trumpet death comes by water. I love Alenardo. He's like, I know the script, man. Now, Alenardo knows the answer already, right? He's read the back of the book. He knows how to interpret things. William examined the cloth, then said, Now everything is clear. William knows, too. Where is Berengar? They asked him. I don't know, he answered. Aimaro heard him and raised his eyes to heaven, murmuring to Peter of Sant'Albano, typically English. Now everything is clear. I don't know, right? Okay, so Aimaro, one of the monks, right, is exasperated with William because he is simultaneously saying that everything is clear and also that he doesn't know the answer. This is a really fun, I love this as a little glimpse of different approaches to interpretation. Of course, understanding a mystery, it's all about interpreting signs, right? It's all about interpreting signs. Jorge is surprised and finds a bloody cloth in Berengar's cell improbable. Jorge, who knows much, not only in the general sense that he's the one he's blind, he's the blind man who sees everything that happens in the monastery and remembers everything he's ever read, apparently. But he was also the one to whom Adelamo confessed before committing suicide. Jorge kind of knows what's going on, or at least he thinks he does. And based on what Jorge knows or believes he knows about what's going on, he finds this bloody cloth does not fit into what he thought was happening. William, by contrast, also thinks he knows what's going on and thinks that the bloody cloth makes everything plain. Though apparently it doesn't mean he knows where Berengar is. He only says to them, I don't know, but you get the impression that what he also means is you're asking the wrong question. He is, it seems, less interested in where Berengar is right now than he is about what's been happening. And of course, I think, can see why he is not curious about where Berengar is. Because he thinks he knows in a sense. He thinks that Berengar was the one they encountered in the scriptorium at night. And that Berengar was the one who was running away from Adso and who hid himself when Adso came out. So he suspects, I think he suspects, that Berengar is still concealing himself somewhere, hiding from him. So he doesn't know where he is, but he's not doesn't seem particularly curious either. But then there's Alenardo. Alenardo, he knows just how to interpret things. Jorge thinks it improbable that a bloody cloth would be found in Berengar's cell. Alenardo finds it more than improbable. It's simply not possible. No. At the third trumpet, death comes by water. He expects that Berengar is dead, but he is confident that Berengar will have drowned, because that's what the book of Revelation says is going to happen when the third trumpet sounds. So, duh. All three of them have different frameworks. All of them have different sets of interpretive data that they're coming at it from. William thinks the conclusion has now been made clear to him. Jorge thinks he already knows. Alenardo thinks he already knows, in a different sense. We're going to end tonight, not just on this, but there's, I think, 3 different slides in this passage, but I was really interested in Adso's contemplation of the library. Having been in the library and had some frightening experience, they got lost in the library and thought they were going to die there or something. And then they happened across the stairs out. And the abbot is pretty sure he knows where they were and is pretty mad at Brother William now. But here's Adso contemplating the monks. Now, before we start reading this, I want to ask you again, as I have before, try to set aside your modern assumptions. This is going to be a particularly hard one to do. This is a chapter that interested me so much because it's another one of those places where I see Umberto Eco really trying to put himself imaginatively into the frame of mind of a 13th century monk, 14th century monk in this case. Alenardo's a 13th century monk who has survived into the 14th century. I want you to try not to respond against this, not to look down on it, and not to throw scorn on it or make fun of it. Try to understand Adso's reasoning here, because I think it's very interesting and it's very important. Very important for trying to understand what an abbey was then. What was at stake? I was struck by their calm, their serenity. Intent on their work, they seemed to forget that one of their brothers was being anxiously sought throughout the grounds, and that 2 others had disappeared in frightful circumstances. Here, I said to myself, is the greatness of our order. For centuries and centuries, men like these have seen the barbarian hordes burst in, sack their abbeys, plunge kingdoms into chasms of fire, and yet they have gone on cherishing parchments and inks, have continued to read, moving their lips over words that have been handed down through centuries and which they will hand down to the centuries to come. They went on reading and copying as the millennium approached. Why should they not continue to do so now? The day before, Benno had said he would be prepared to sin in order to procure a rare book. He was not lying and not joking. A monk should surely love his books with humility, wishing their good and not the glory of his own curiosity. But what the temptation of adultery is for laymen, and the yearning for riches is for secular ecclesiastics, the seduction of knowledge is for monks. Okay, so notice we've got two things he emphasizes. First, the greatness of, this is what makes monks awesome. Their humble, persistent focus on the books, on the words, on inks and parchment. No matter what happens in the world around them, including, like Viking invaders coming and sacking the abbey they're sitting in, they will continue. They've gone on cherishing parchments and inks, have continued to read, moving their lips over words that have been handed down through the centuries and which they will hand down to the centuries to come. The persistence, the humility of that. This is the strength of the monastic order. But it comes with a danger. Benno had said he would be prepared to sin in order to procure a rare book. Everyone has some great temptation. Adultery, very common temptation for laymen, that is, for people who are not in the church, right? They are often going to be tempted into sexual sin. The prevailing sin of secular ecclesiastics, which you will remember what that means, right? The secular clergy are the parish priests and bishops. The secular ecclesiastic, those priests out there in the world, they get tempted by riches, right? That's their besetting sin. For monks, the besetting sin is the seduction of knowledge. The desire to know more, and to read more. That is a temptation parallel to personal enrichment and the hoarding of wealth and adultery. How? How does that work? Why should that be? I was not surprised that the mystery of the crime should involve the library. For these men devoted to writing, the library was at once the celestial Jerusalem and an underground world on the border between Terra Incognita and Hades. They were dominated by the library, by its promises and by its prohibitions. They lived with it, for it, and perhaps against it, sinfully hoping one day to violate all its secrets. Why should they not have risked death to satisfy a curiosity of their minds, or have killed to prevent someone from appropriating a jealously guarded secret of their own? He's illustrating how the desire for knowledge is a temptation, why it's so dangerous. The library of this monastery, it is at once the celestial Jerusalem. Do you understand that reference? I'll give you one guess as to which book of the Bible the celestial Jerusalem is in. The Book of Revelation, Fencing Frog. You are completely correct. At the end of the Book of Revelation, after the end of the world, when all things are being made new, when every promise is to be fulfilled, celestial Jerusalem, descends. That is the New Jerusalem, the new heaven and the new earth and the New Jerusalem appears. The place where God will dwell with his people. And okay. So it's a good thing. It's not just a good, it's not only like heaven. The celestial Jerusalem is the place where the heaven and earth are perfectly married together, where humans and God dwell, have their home together. It's this like final consummation in this way. The library is the celestial Jerusalem and an underground world on the border between Terra Incognita and Hades, that is, and hell itself. It's kind of both at the same time. Terra Incognita, which is what was written in Latin on maps, right? Land unknown. The place that you want to explore, that you're curious about and want to learn about. But it's right next door to hell, right? Which is where you could end up through your reckless exploration. They were dominated by the library, by its promises and its prohibitions, sinfully hoping one day to violate all its secrets. Their desire for its secrets is sinful and would lead them into sin. Temptations, to be sure, intellectual pride. Quite different was the scribe monk, imagined by our sainted founder, Saint Benedict. Capable of copying without understanding, surrendered to the will of God, writing as if praying, and praying inasmuch as he was writing. Why was it no longer so? This is the monk copyist envisioned by Saint Benedict. The person who is devoted to the preservation of knowledge while himself being perfectly immune from the temptations that were the temptation to intellectual pride that are contained in knowledge. Why was it no longer so? Oh, this was surely not only the degeneration of our order. It had become too powerful. Its abbots competed with kings. In Abo, did I not perhaps have the example of a monarch who, with monarch's demeanor, tried to settle controversies between monarchs? It's kind of exactly how Abo is acting, right? He has put forward his little dominion here, this abbey, as a neutral state, right, in which the supporters of the Pope and the supporters of the Emperor can come together for a summit meeting, which is what's about to be happening, right, in the abbey. And yes, violate is a very strong word there, Jackie. It is, I believe that he intends, very firmly intends, the echo of rape, to violate the secrets of the library is like committing rape. Yeah. The very knowledge that the abbeys had accumulated was now used as barter goods, cause for pride, motive for boasting and prestige. Just as knights displayed armor and standards, our abbots displayed illuminated manuscripts. The abbey is supposed to preserve knowledge, to preserve wisdom. And it's become this source of pride, of intellectual pride. This is the degeneration of their order in its very success. It's always success that ruined monasteries. Sorry, that's my own personal commentary on the Middle Ages. Monasteries were great ideas. They worked so well that they all failed. That's my history of monasticism in one sentence. Keep going. The abbey where I was staying was probably the last to boast of excellence in the production and reproduction of learning. But perhaps for this very reason, the monks were no longer content with the holy work of copying. They wanted also to produce new complements of nature, impelled by the lust for novelty. And they did not realize, as I sensed vaguely at the moment, and know clearly today, now aged in years and experience, that in doing so they sanctioned the destruction of their excellence. Because if this new learning they wanted to produce were to circulate freely outside those walls, then nothing would distinguish that sacred place any longer from a cathedral school or a city university. Remaining isolated, on the other hand, it maintained its prestige and its strength intact. It was not corrupted by disputation, by the quodlibetical conceit that would subject every mystery and every greatness to the scrutiny of the sic et non. That is a wonderful sentence. Do you see the danger that he is describing? Preserve knowledge, but what does he want them not to do? What does he believe it essential that they not do? They wanted to produce new complements of nature. That's complements with an E. Impelled by the lust for novelty. Yeah, no new learning. No new learning. New learning is the whole problem. That's what's going to lead to the destruction of the abbey. New learning. Do you see why? Again, this is where I was saying we have to try to put ourselves into Adso's perspective. Yes, art is a complement of nature. Art and human learning, right? To add on to what nature has provided. Because you're always seeking novelty. What's the problem with it? Do you see what he says would happen to the abbey? It would be destroyed. In what sense would it be destroyed? The excellence of the abbey, how would it be destroyed? Listen to the last part again. If this new learning they wanted to produce were to circulate freely outside those walls, then nothing would distinguish that sacred place from a cathedral school or a city university. Well, what's so wrong about that? Remaining isolated, on the other hand, it maintained its prestige and its strength intact. It was not corrupted by disputation, by the quodlibetical conceit that would subject every mystery and every greatness to the scrutiny of the sic et non. That last part is the hard part. Rather obscurely stated. Do you know what sic et non means in Latin? It is the title of a treatise that has already been alluded to, in fact, argued about by, what's his name, Jorge and Brother William. Yeah, thus and not, like yes and no. Yeah, exactly. Yes and no, essentially yes and no. Abelard wrote a treatise called Sic et Non. The castrated Abelard, whose castration Jorge mocked, which Brother William objected to. Sic et non. It refers to an approach where you carefully consider a proposition from both sides. Abelard's Sic et non is a treatise where he goes through arguing both sides of like almost every major doctrinal point, scrutinizing the whole thing logically from both directions. It may shock you to hear this was not popular with a lot of people. A lot of people thought he was mocking the doctrines, basically. the scrutiny of the sic et non. Corrupted by disputation, by the quodlibetical conceit. Isn't that a wonderful word? Quodlibetical conceit. The word quodlibetical means something a lot like purely academic. The academic and intellectual conceit that would subject every mystery and every greatness to the scrutiny of the sic et non. Adso believes that to take knowledge, ancient knowledge, and subject it to this to a careful, rigorous academic scrutiny would be horrible. Yeah, good. Sphinx has a better definition than my crude one. Quodlibet literally means whatever one wants. So quodlibetical questions are a form of disputation where any question can be asked. Yes. So a quodlibetical conceit is the idea, right? The concept that you can ask any question that you want of every mystery and scrutinize everything from every direction. Nothing is sacred. Yeah, exactly. Let's drag everything out and think it all through and debate it all through, corrupted by disputation. I'd ask this question, but it's obscure to answer, so I won't ask it. I'll just tell it. You may remember this happened with Ubertino, in the conversation with Ubertino, and I believe in the conversation with Jorge as well. Both of them alluded to the schools, like the schools in Paris, the theological schools in Paris, and what the theological schools in Paris were associated with. These are city universities that they're referring to, like the Sorbonne, which is already founded. And what they're famous for is disputation, arguments, and therefore creating factions, creating divisions, and having different sides disputing points. There is a kind of corruption to disputation. And one of the problems with subjecting every mystery and greatness to the scrutiny of the sic et non is that you're going to get tons of people with clashing opinions who are now, and it's going to be trouble. Yes, Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas taught there in Paris. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and Gerald, and now we get your right to remember the heresy question, specifically Adso's heresy question. How do you tell the difference, right? Adso's anxiety. Is there no ground to stand on? Can't we, shouldn't we, doesn't somebody know the difference between a heretic and not a heretic, right? Yeah. Adso views all of these things as a kind of fall, a destruction of the peculiar excellence of this abbey. Notice, and this is important, the abbey where I was staying was probably the last to boast of excellence in the production and reproduction of learning. This was what the abbeys were for. It's what they did. That's why St. Benedict talks about it as one of the jobs of a monk, to do copying. 500 years before, there weren't any cathedrals, schools, there weren't any universities. I know, we tend to think of things like Oxford and the Sorbonne as like ancient institutions. But in the 14th century, those are the newfangled things. And like now that these universities have formed in cities, it's all over, right? learning and civilization is all going straight over the hill, right? But before the universities were even dreamt of, hundreds of years before they were dreamt of, there were still the abbeys. The abbeys which were collecting books and preserving books and recopying books. That was the excellence that the abbeys had. They were the greatest producers and reproducers of learning in the world. But they were not centers for debate and disputation. They were not subject to any quodlibetical conceits, where anyone was encouraged to ask any question that they want. See, I said we have to distance ourselves, and I talked about not heaping scorn on things because almost all of us have been raised and trained in environments where those things are considered sacred, right? I mean, higher education, the eventual fruit of these city universities, right? Considers something near sacred the right to ask whatever you wish, to subject things to the scrutiny of the sic et non, right? To think carefully and analytically and objectively about things. This is the basis of learning, and learning is the point. The idea that there is something desirable and praiseworthy in resisting that is a point of view that's very difficult for us to force ourselves. It's a shape that it's hard to force our minds into with our own training. Fencing Frog, you are exactly right. Even with knowledge, the poison is in the dose. Yeah, exactly. Remember, Adso began this whole thing by admiring the monks and what they did, their patient perseverance, their love of books and love of knowledge. But he sees the danger in that. And the cathedral schools and the city universities, those are the places now where things have now run out of control. No longer do you have that balance. Anyway, so yeah. Well, so yeah. Art and paintbrush, that's exactly what I want to be careful of. It's a perfectly relevant point, and I'm glad you brought it up, but I want to think about that for a second. The anti-intellectualism, censorship, and scorn at questioning the Bible and held beliefs, etc., among some populations of current-day Christianity seems to rhyme here. I think it does not, actually. I understand why you say that, and certainly this is what that's going to make us think of, but that's actually, I think, wholly untrue. Let me try to explain that. It's wholly untrue because of the soil out of which it is growing. What was the phrase you had? Populations. The populations of current day Christianity. I'm not in any way denying those things. And believe me, Argent Paintbrush, I would be surprised if you had encountered more of that than I have at closer vantage point. But so I'm not in any way denying that. But what I'm saying is those populations of modern Christianity that do manifest those things are growing out of the modern soil. That is, They are growing up within the culture that assumes disputation, quodlibetical conceits, and the scrutiny of the sic et non is the obviously correct way to do things. And they're reacting against that with various kinds of motivations. But that's very different. It's entirely different from the frame of someone who has not seen that and who hasn't grown that. A modern person who is anti-intellectual, like actually anti-intellectual, not just, there are people who are anti-intellectual in the sense that like they like genuinely don't approve of learning and intellectualism. But a modern anti-intellectual is born within, oriented to, but wanting to rebel against the modern perspective. This perspective is a completely different perspective, a pre-modern perspective, which sees this new one coming and resists it because it knows that something important is going to be lost. You know the parallel that I wanted to make? You know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of Plato. That passage of Plato that so many people get shocked by when they see it. When Plato says that he doesn't think writing is a good idea. A society, a sophisticated, even in some ways intellectual society like that of ancient Greece, but which is right at the cusp of converting from a dominantly oral culture to a dominantly written culture. At that time, Plato says, you know what? This whole writing thing, it's going to wreck us. It's a bad idea. And he's not wrong. Yeah, exactly. I think it's in Phaedrus. I don't remember it so well. It's been a long time since I've read it. Argent Paintbrush. I mostly remember the reaction I first had when I read it. I was like, are you kidding me? Right? Jocelyn, just like calculators. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Plato was not, of course, saying that writing is evil. He was not anti-intellectual, right? He wasn't. But what he was saying, he was speaking from the perspective of someone who knew oral culture, who recognized that the old, like the new ways which were coming, were in a sense a step forward. But they would come at a cost. The printing press came at a cost too. It also is a step forward, and we can't imagine the world without it. But there are things that they had in the old world that we don't anymore, that we lose anymore. You know how many of you have seen people react? Many of you have had that reaction. How many of you have had the experience of sitting in a room, especially a room full of young people younger than you, and everyone's sitting around in the room and they're all on their phones, like texting, or even more absurdly, like texting each other, right? We're all sitting around in the room together and nobody's talking and nobody's looking at each other, right? You ever had that experience where you're in a room like that and you're just like, what is happening to our society, right? Undergrad, yeah. Well, here's the thing. If somebody in the 14th century had seen a room full of people all reading books in silence, all sitting next to each other, all holding a book, and all reading their books silently, they would have had the same kind of reaction. They would have been like, what are we doing? This is ridiculous. Our society is crumbling. Totally would have had that reaction. Because before the printing press, before books were readily available, reading was a communal experience. You didn't not consume stories. You consume stories in community, which is different and cool. And the printing press is a step forward. It is. Just like writing was a step forward. But something's lost. Something was genuinely lost when we... And the same is true of the internet, right? The internet was a step forward, but some things were lost. Some of us are old enough to remember, right? Anyway, this is the kind of thing I think that ADSO is pointing to here. Free inquiry, academic freedom, critical thinking. These are all great things. And the making of knowledge public to everyone's scrutiny and the encouragement of public debate. These are good things. But something's lost. Something's lost when you go there that you can't get back, right? And in some ways, it's kind of similar, actually. In fact, it reminds me most of the development of the internet. The world we now live in which anyone can write anything and put it out there for anyone on earth to read, is a step forward in a lot of ways. But something's lost. Several things are lost, actually, in that, right? And what happens? Is it all good? There are many wonderful things about it, says I, who founded an internet university, right? And yet, the same things that make the internet wonderful are the very things that create horrible, toxic, society-eroding internet comment pages, right? Yes, quadlibetical conceit is awfully like misinformation age, Sphinx. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In this passage, what I love about this passage is that Umberto Eco is here doing a really unusual thing. This is the kind of thing that almost no like writers of like historical fiction ever actually do. And that is really trying to put yourself into the mindset. He's trying to capture here the mindset of somebody who has experienced and appreciates what will be lost, who doesn't just view the onset of the age of scientific inquiry as an obvious good thing, the way of the future. It's not that it isn't. It's just that there's a cost. Look at his response to it. There, I said to myself, are the reasons for the silence and the darkness that surround the library. It is the preserve of learning, but can maintain this learning unsullied only if it prevents its reaching anyone at all, even amongst themselves. Learning is not like a coin, which remains physically whole even through the most infamous transactions. It is rather like a very handsome dress, which is worn out through use and ostentation. Is not a book like that, in fact? Its pages crumble, its ink and gold turn dull, if too many hands touch it. I saw Pacificus of Tivoli leafing through an ancient volume whose pages had become stuck together because of the humidity. He moistened his thumb and forefinger with his tongue to leaf through his book, and at every touch of his saliva, those pages lost vigor. Opening them meant folding them, exposing them to the harsh action of air and dust, which would erode the subtle wrinkles of the parchment and would produce mildew where the saliva had softened but also weakened the corner of the page. As an excess of sweetness makes the warrior flaccid and inept, this excess of possessive and curious love would make the book vulnerable to the disease destined to kill it. What should be done? Stop reading and only preserve? Were my fears correct? What would my master have said? Now, JJ, you're right that it's the book that deteriorates, not the knowledge. But remember, he's using that as a metaphor for the knowledge itself, for learning itself. Learning, he says, is not like a coin, but rather like a dress which is worn out through use and ostentation. Is not a book like that, in fact. The book itself is a metaphor for learning. Learning is like a handsome dress which is worn out through use and ostentation. When you bring it out, when you put it on and wear it and show it off, it wears out. It gets twisted, less beautiful. But also anyone who gets their saliva on books is a heretic and needs to have punishment. Maybe that's the difference. Yeah. Fencing Frog says you can't just leave the dress in the closet and go naked. I mean, I guess you could. Well, yeah. It's not about that. It's about the preservation of the dress. If you have a very handsome dress, right? What's the only way to keep it in good condition, right? Seal it up and never take it out. That's how. It's the same way how to keep a book. How to keep a book intact, right? Notice how he's dramatizing, not just, the monk licking his fingers and using that to turn the pages of the book, but even the action, the harsh action of air and dust, any exposure to light of the pages, the action of the turning, the conditions of the room as the pages are exposed. It's going to lead the book to be destroyed. So learning is like that. The library of this abbey is the preserve of learning, but can maintain this learning unsullied only if it prevents its reaching anyone at all, even the monks themselves. The saliva is part of the point, right? He's not praising Pacificus of Tivoli, who is licking his fingers and getting his saliva on the book. But he's saying, this is what happens. This is what happens if you let people read books. They're going to do things like this. You can't stop them. See, those of you who are objecting, right, Jocelyn, you who want to declare a heretic anyone who would get their saliva on books, do you see what that makes you? That makes you orthodox, right? You are of an orthodox school of book, like obviously there is correct way. There are correct ways to treat this learning. And obviously this proves that you cannot entrust this learning to just anybody, because look what they'll do with it. You know how to treat it. They don't. They're not going to treat it properly. They're going to do things that are going to lead to its destruction. And you know it, and they don't because they're ignorant. You see what I mean? Like that's exactly how it works. That's exactly the metaphor. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Jocelyn says she would embrace being an inquisitor when it comes to where favorite books are concerned. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Sphinx, it is really interesting that he compares it to a warrior culture, isn't it? As an excess of sweetness makes the warrior flaccid and inept. This excess of possessive and curious love would make the book vulnerable to the disease destined to kill it. The very love, the very passion that leads the monks to their long and patient perseverance that Adso admired so much is as destructive to learning as an excess of sweetness is to the warrior. Learning can only be preserved for all time if it's never shared at all. The monk can only have perfect learning if they do not have possessive and curious love of learning. Any excess of that love is going to corrupt it. But Adso doesn't see the way out. What should be done? Stop reading and only preserve? Were my fears correct? Then he looks at these other two monks that are making a book, right? One is scraping the vellum. The other is pinning a page down and drawing lines on it with a ruler, right, to prepare it for illumination and stuff. Those two brothers, I said to myself, are living their hours of paradise on earth. They were producing new books, just like those that in time would inexorably destroy. Therefore, the library could not be threatened by any earthly force. It was a living thing. But if it was living, why should it not be open to the risk of knowledge? Was this what Benno wanted, and what Venantius perhaps had wanted? I felt confused, afraid of my own thoughts. Perhaps they were not fitting for a novice, who should only follow the rule scrupulously and humbly through all the years to come, which is what I subsequently did, without asking myself further questions, while around me the world was sinking deeper and deeper into a storm of blood and madness. Adso tells us that in the rest of his life, between when these events happened and when he is writing this account, he has subsequently left intellectual curiosity behind, following the rules scrupulously and humbly, without asking myself further questions. Is this right? Is this the best thing to do? While all around him the world was sinking deeper and deeper into a storm of blood and madness. And the Black Death hits Europe, Gerald? Yes, exactly. Adso himself is not sure. But and I don't think, and it seems to me perfectly clear that Brother William would have a quite different perspective on this, right? This chapter, one of the things that makes this chapter so interesting is that Brother William is not in it at all. These are just Adso's solo contemplations, right? These are things that are interesting for us to be thinking about, issues for us to continue to consider. And with that, I'm done. And I've finished all my slides and we're caught up with where I said we would read. So for next time, we're in the third day now, right? So let's go ahead and read the next 3 chapters. Yeah. Through Vespers. That's a lot. But I'm feeling frisky. Through Vespers. Unless Vespers is no, it's not very long. Yeah, let's go through Vespers. Up to, but not including after Compline. That's where we can go. Okay. Oh, yes. So if you get to the part where Ubertino is going to actually tell Adso the story of Fra Dolcino, don't read that because you're not ready for it yet. Just like Adso. Brother William tells him he's not ready for Fra Dolcino, so neither are we. So, yeah. Okay. Up to and not including after Compline. Yes. All right. Thank you, everybody. Wait a second. Next week is Thanksgiving week. Yeah. Next week, Thanksgiving week. Not next week. Right. The week after next. Yeah, I'll be doing Thanksgiving stuff next week. So the week after next is the week to which I allude. That would be December, whatever that is. 4th, I think. December 4th. Yep. That's when it'll be. So look, there's extra time to read those extra pages. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye now.